You have over 60,000 thoughts every day, and most of them are repeats from yesterday. Imagine a battlefield that refreshes itself every dawn, an invisible war where every decision, every success, every quiet regret is forged long before the body moves. That was the image that woke him fully. Not a storm outside, but a weapons room inside his skull. He called himself the Man because names can be distractions. He was not legendary when the story begins. He was a professional who showed up, did the work, failed in ways people shrugged at, and succeeded in ways people later admired. His apartment smelled of coffee and printer ink. His calendar hummed with so many obligations that his mind had become a crowded barracks, soldiers of thought lining up, shouting orders that rarely aligned. He could feel the script playing before he even spoke, a rehearsed voice that told him what's possible and what he's forbidden to try. One morning, muted dawn light through the blinds, he noticed the old pattern, a cascade of can't, not yet, what if, rolling through him like an army marching in a narrow valley. It wasn't the content alone that startled him. It was the realization that nearly all of those commands came from habit and habit alone. They were not fresh judgments formed by the moment. They were software, pre-written, reloaded every day, controlling hardware he had taken for granted. That morning he made a simple vow, the kind that sounds dramatic in memory but felt precise in the moment. He would train his mind like a weapon, not to harm, but to sharpen, to aim, to make decisions with speed and fidelity. He wanted a mind that could be directed, repointed, and trusted in chaos. He wanted mental tools that would not betray him when stakes rose and the body tightened. He did not begin by seeking a miracle. He began by counting his thoughts and noticing how many of them were autoplay. He began by admitting that victory, more often than we think, happens before the world even shows up. If you are listening and this lands, if something in you answers to the word vow, then consider this an invitation. Commit to one focused practice for the next 30 days. Choose one small discipline in this story, follow it daily, and let it show you what repetition does to a mind. He started with awareness, because a weapon must first be held in light. The first weeks were obsession with noticing. He set a simple rule. The first time in any hour he felt a surge, a spike of anxiety, a tightness, a rush of judgment, he would name it out loud. Not to judge the thought, but to label it. Doubt, he'd say. What if, he'd say. Anger. The act of naming shifted the chemistry. Labeling is a kind of light that trips off the unconscious autopilot. Scene. He was at a crosswalk, earbuds in, late for a meeting. A stranger's glance felt like accusation, and an old voice, one of those inherited lines, spat, "You always look foolish."
He stopped mid-step and named it. Old shame. The sound of the phrase in his own mouth loosened the grip for a fraction of a second. That gap was enough to choose a different posture, a different breath, a small, mundane victory that felt like a footstep into new territory. Practice, awareness prompt. Throughout the day, notice one recurring thought. When you catch it, say its name. Do not argue with it. Simply label it and note where you feel it in the body. After a week, write down the two most frequent labels. He discovered that awareness itself is a lever. It's not yet reprogramming, but it interrupts unconscious momentum. In the narrative of his life, awareness became the sentry at the gates, the first system that would tell him whether an automatic response was marching into a high-stakes situation. And then came the flashbacks, not cinematic memories, but lines. Teachers saying, "You try too hard." Parents murmuring, "Some people are just born that way." A well-meaning relative applauding smallness. He saw the architecture of his prisons, phrases laid like bricks into wet cement at the most impressionable moments. They hardened into assumptions that ran the show beneath his conscious choices. In one of those late-night moments, he opened an old box of things and found a report card margin note. Tends to shoulder too much responsibility, needs to lighten up. The memory of the teacher's voice hummed like a low-frequency command. He traced the path from that line to the way he negotiated deals years later, always apologetic for asking for what he deserved. The metaphor that helped him think about these inherited beliefs was simple: wet cement. Early experiences are impressions into soft material. Repetition seals them. If you watch your mind long enough, you start to see dotted lines connecting a parent's phrasing to your financial caution, a childhood tease to your fear of public exposure. Most of it runs under the surface. That is the hidden prison. Micro-practice. Detective questions. Pick one belief you suspect is inherited. Ask, where did I first hear this? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? Who benefits if I keep believing this? Write brief answers. This is not about denial, it's about testing the origin story. He did not proceed politely. He interrogated those old sentences. He found answers that were thin and anecdotes that contradicted the claims. He found mentors and strangers who had once been told the same limits and then demolished them. The discovery was equal parts scary and liberating. The prison had doors he had never noticed. But changing those doors required an understanding of the machinery, the brain. He read, he listened, he tested, always holding humility for the complexity of the organ he hoped to change. He learned the core idea that mattered most for his project. The brain is plastic. Not mystical plastic, but biological malleability.
Connections that are fired together tend to wire together. The phrase, neurons that fire together, wire together, became his shorthand for hope. He did not mistake metaphor for certainty. He learned enough neuroscience to be practical, not dogmatic. The prefrontal cortex is the executive. The amygdala is the alarm. Habits live in circuits that can be grown fuller with repetition. Neural changes begin immediately with new experience. Habits often take weeks to form, with averages sometimes noted around 66 days. But human lives are variable. Results are probabilistic, not guaranteed. That nuance kept him from promises and kept him patient. He practiced mental rehearsal as early evidence of change. The first visualization felt odd. He sat at his kitchen table, breathed into sensation, and imagined entering a room where a major presentation would happen. He built the scene slowly, the color of the stage lights, the tap of a microphone, the weight in his hands as he held his notes. He imagined a moment of distraction and then practiced the interruption and the redirect within that mental stage. The rehearsal sharpened his anticipation. When the real moment arrived, it was less surprising. Mini exercise, simple visualization rehearsal. Close your eyes and build a small scene. The place, the object you hold, the sound in the room. Place a challenge in that scene, a tough question, a hostile look. Practice interrupting the negative loop by naming the emotion, taking a controlled breath, and replaying an alternative response that is small and doable. The man noticed something crucial. Visualization itself is only fuel if it carries emotion and sensory detail. It is not enough to think, I will be calm. He had to feel the calm, hear how it resonated in his chest, smell the coffee in the balcony, taste the dryness of his mouth, and then make that mouth steady with practice. The senses anchor the rehearsal. Repetition lays down the tracks for future action. He moved next to the architecture of training, 4 pillars that would hold the work. He framed them simply: awareness, interruption, redirection, reinforcement, because an elegant plan is more likely to be followed. Each pillar was both distinct and connected, a flow from noticing to changing to making new stronger. Pillar 1, awareness, he had entered. It was the sentry. Pillar 2, interruption, required a tool he could deploy in the heat of a spiral. He called it a circuit breaker, a physical or sensory action that creates a gap between stimulus and response. It might be a quick posture shift, a grounding touch to the wrist, a brisk inhale that changes the body's chemistry. Scene. He sat in the lobby of a big firm, about to negotiate terms. Panic snaked up, his palms sweated. He had rehearsed breathing and labeling, but the old pattern still wanted to drown him in scenario loops. He tapped the heel of his hand against his thigh, a small percussion he had trained. The tap was the sound of a key turning. The voice inside, momentarily interrupted, stuttered. He breathed. He spoke. The negotiation proceeded not perfectly, but differently. Practice, circuit breaker drill. Choose a physical cue, a wrist tap, a heel drop, a stand-in stretch. When you notice an unhelpful thought escalating, commit to perform the cue 3 times. Name the thought, take 1 slow breath, and choose a single immediate small action. Interruption is simple in concept, but demanding in habit. The first time it worked, he felt relief. The 100th time it worked, the pattern began to fray. But behavior change rarely yields linear progress. He had false starts, days he forgot the cue in the moment, days when the cue felt ridiculous and he abandoned it. Each failure taught him to design the context, keep the cue accessible, practice it in low-stakes situations, and tie it to a sensory anchor so the body learns it without the mind's full consent. Redirection, the 3rd pillar, is where intentional programming begins. After the gap created by interruption, something must be placed into the gap. He wrote redirect phrases that were short, true, and emotionally resonant. They weren't cheerleading slogans. They were specific micro-messages that stated a desired action in the present tense. I gather facts first, he wrote for anxiety about judgment. I speak to lead, not to be liked, he wrote for negotiation fear. He tested statements until they sounded plausible rather than dramaturgic. Scene. At a team meeting, a colleague dismissed his idea with an offhand joke.
The old reflex was humiliation. He felt the familiar hot flash of shame, and his old program wanted to withdraw. He labeled it humiliation. He tapped his knee 3 times, the circuit breaker. Then, instead of the old retreat, he spoke his redirection. Let me lay out the facts, and then he did. It was not grand, it was precise. The team listened differently. The moment did not become an anthem of triumph, but it was a distinct new recording in his history. Reinforcement, the 4th pillar, is what cements the new programming. Small wins must be noticed and rewarded. He designed micro-rewards, a 5-minute walk after a successful redirect, a quick note to his journal, a single line recorded in a voice memo that said, "Today I chose the new response." Over time, these small redemptions built a cadence of positive feedback that the brain could accept as useful behavior. Practice, redirect, and reinforce. Choose one redirect phrase that feels true and actionable. When you interrupt a thought, say it aloud. After you act on it, record one sentence describing the outcome. Repeat this daily. But the work was not merely technical. There was emotion, heavy, sticky, contagious. He ran into emotional hijacking earlier than he expected. A public speaking moment, a family argument, a sudden business setback. Each threatened to sweep him into primitive reaction.
The amygdala's alarms are ancient and loud, and the prefrontal cortex's moderation arrives only if given a gap to engage. That is why state stacking was one of his early discoveries. Instead of waiting for calm, create it by stacking small, controllable states before the fight. He practiced a 1-minute stack before every call. Posture, breath, a win recall, and a brief sensory anchor. The stack shifted baseline states enough that when stress arrived, it found a different nervous system. It was not a cure, it was buffering. In one early test, he misapplied the pillars and felt the cost. He had a major pitch, and the stakes felt cosmic. He rehearsed visuals and redirect phrases, but he skipped reinforcement that morning, and he ignored sleep. Mid-pitch, a question struck him like cold water. His inner critic, that voice that had gotten fatter with neglect, roared, "You're exposed." He forgot the pause. He tried to recall his redirect, and the phrase dissolved. He left the room feeling raw and suspicious of the method itself. That failure was instructive. Training must be holistic. Skills work in concert, and the body must be respected. He then redesigned his training like an athlete adjusting a practice schedule. He scheduled blocks of low-stakes rehearsal, planned recovery, and set mini exposures where he would deliberately seek mild resistance to test new responses. He built redundancy into the system, multiple circuit breakers, several redirect phrases, and a short list of sensory anchors. He called this phase debugging, a term borrowed from software, which suits the metaphor. You create a program, run it, find faults, and patch. Installation began to feel more like a professional craft than self-help. He adopted a mentor's model, not to copy, but to extract patterns. He studied a champion's rehearsal routine, an entrepreneur's negotiation strategy, an athlete's officiating of emotion spikes. He downloaded behaviors by imitating them in micro-sessions until they fit his body. He learned that imitation is an efficient shortcut when paired with personalization. Mimicry without adaptation feels false. Mimicry with editing becomes a bridge. Practice: deletion, downloading, debugging. Identify one unhelpful habit to delete, for example, ruminating for 30 minutes after a setback. Replace it by downloading one mentor behavior for 7 days, for example, a 5-minute constructive debrief. Test it, note failures, and iterate the next week. As the training matured, he moved into deeper techniques. Mental time travel became one of his favorite tools. He would imagine his future self 5 years ahead and ask that version what choice to make now. The future self was a vantage point with different priorities and a longer view of consequences. It was less reactive and more strategic because it had the benefit of distance. Scene: in a dimly lit stairwell after a heated email exchange, he imagined his future self a decade ahead.
That version was calm, lean, and less interested in the petty score. From that vantage, the current outrage seemed petty. The future voice suggested a short reply. "Let's discuss solutions." He wrote the line and sent it. The reply changed the thread's tenor. Another tool was multidimensional thinking, not simply pros and cons on a flat list, but mapping outcomes across time, relationships, and identity. He would ask, what does this choice do to my time 5 years from now, to my relationships, to how I see myself? The method is like running a lightweight simulation, one that highlights trade-offs rather than polarities. Attention hacking also became essential. He recognized that the mind is like a flashlight. Where it points, things become vivid. He learned to move his attention strategically, to focus on pieces of reality that support his intentional actions, and to ignore appetites for drama. He adjusted environments to reduce friction for desired behavior. He removed notifications during deep work, put his phone on grayscale, moved his chair to a sunlit spot to make practice pleasurable. Architecture at the level of small design choices can be decisive. He began to notice cumulative change. The early months were not an arc of sudden mastery. They were a montage of small shifts that accrued weight. He kept a journal,
not to tally victories or manufacture positivity, but to create a factual feed of evidence that could be referenced when doubt rose. The entries were simple: the trigger, the intervention, the outcome. Over time, the lean record told a story his nervous system could accept. New responses are possible. Yet, humility remained central. He refused absolute claims. Neuroscience had given him a map, but he knew the terrain still had cliffs. Some people need clinical care, and some problems require professionals. The training he described is for those who seek performance improvements and clearer command of their mental life, not a substitute for therapy when trauma or disorder is at play. By month 3, he tested a pattern creation strategy: automatic success patterns. He wanted responses that would fire not because he remembered a phrase, but because a trigger, environmental or social, reliably cued a practice behavior. He designed triggers intentionally. A specific mug on his desk became the cue to rehearse deep breathing. A red note on the front of his notebook signaled a quick 2-minute visualization before any presentation. Small design choices created default actions. Scene: he arrived at a conference with 3 people he respected. In the past, his mind would tangle with a loop of comparison. This time, the cues did their work: the mug, the breath, the thought of a tactical question to ask the first person he met. He entered conversations with inquiries rather than defense. The pattern held. People responded. He noticed his posture, the pitch of his voice, and how the room adjusted.
These months were not free of setbacks. A public criticism from a respected peer still landed like a blow. Sometimes his inner critic, that old voice, swelled into a nearly physical presence, chewing away at confidence. It whispered catastrophic images and rewrote the outcomes he feared. Yet the training made those moments different. They lasted less, they were named sooner, and they had a pause before action. One evening, after a particularly draining day, he sat at his window and wrote a short protocol for emotional hijacking. The protocol was simple enough to be memorized: spot the signal, interrupt with a circuit breaker, stack a calming state, redirect with a short phrase, and rehearse the moment in micro. It read like a field manual. The manual comforted him. It was not a talisman that erased pain, but it was a method he could trust enough to use. Practice: emotional early warning system. List 3 sensations that often precede a spiral for you. Example: tight throat, rapid thoughts, stomach drop. For each, decide an interruption action and a redirect. Practice this sequence in a low-stakes moment until it feels natural. As the training progressed, he sought mentorship not only from people but from models, athletes, leaders, teachers. He studied how champions rehearse failures as part of practice. An Olympic runner he read about didn't merely practice the race, they practiced the stumble, the misstep, the crowd noise, the wrong call. The runner's logic was that success needs inoculation against the unexpected. He incorporated obstacle inoculation into his visualizations. He imagined the stage lights failing, a tough question, a sudden loss of words. He practiced recovery scripts. The practice made him less brittle. One quiet afternoon, a neighbor's child barreled into his apartment with a scraped knee in need for immediate comfort. He realized in that small moment that his training had effects beyond negotiation in keynote presentations. The way he spoke to the child, the measured tone, the reassurance without inflating fears, the quick grounding question was different. His mind, trained like a weapon, had sharpened his capacity to serve. Service became one of his moral anchors. The weapon metaphor was not about force, but about precision and responsibility. Yet the story was not linear. A month later, he was blindsided by a business partner's criticism that touched on a decades-old insecurity. The old script swarmed. He used the pillars, but the inner critic was louder than usual. He labeled, he tapped, he tried to redirect, and for a moment, nothing shifted. The failure hurt. He called a friend who had seen his work and admitted he had lost the pattern. The friend said a simple thing: "We test strength where it matters. Get curious about the failure." That curiosity, a soft reframe, allowed him to tantalize the moment without shame. He returned to debugging.
He identified 3 failures: fatigue, inadequate reinforcement that week, and the presence of a particular phrase from a childhood memory that had aired during the criticism. So he redesigned. He scheduled recovery sleep, he added a micro-reward immediately after a redirect, and he wrote an emergency redirect phrase that addressed the childhood line directly. The changes were small but precise, and they mattered. The pattern of training matured into a craft that combined scientific humility with the confident belief that human minds can be stretched and redirected. The man's transformation was not about becoming aloof or robotic. It was about gaining a tool set for clarity when emotion tried to commandeer the ship. At the end of the 3rd month, a real test loomed. A high-stakes presentation before a mixed audience of investors and skeptics, a cohort that could tip his project's fate. For weeks, he rehearsed every aspect: visualization with sensory detail, circuit breaker practice, reinforcement scaffolds, mental time travel to check the strategic consequences, attention architecture to remove distractions, and a stack of redirect phrases tailored for likely disruptions. He had also prepared a pre-game ritual to optimize state: a short walk to layer calm, a specific playlist that put his body in a steady rhythm, and a simple chant that reminded him of identity, not as brag, but as North Star. The night before, his doubt crept in, as it always did. The inner critic found a seam and whispered, louder than it had in weeks. He named it in his journal, traced it to an old "not enough" script, and then wrote a new line he could use in the moment. He rehearsed it quietly on his balcony, feeling the city hum below. He was not unafraid. He was practiced. On the day, he left his apartment with the ritual items in his pocket. The world outside felt ordinary and indifferent, which in a way is perfect for testing mastery. The arena will not adapt to your rehearsal. It will present the same stimuli, but your mind will respond differently. He arrived at the venue early. Backstage, the air smelled of coffee and stage makeup. Presenters moved in measured patterns. He checked his notes once, then stripped them from the table, an intentional act to force reliance on rehearsal rather than crutch. He felt the familiar tightness at the base of his throat, the first signal. He named it softly to himself, tapped his knee twice as trained, and recited his short redirect. Deliver facts, invite curiosity. The action felt rehearsed enough to begin. When he walked on stage, lights hit his face, and the audience blurred into a sea of shapes. The first question from the floor was unexpectedly sharp and personal, not an attack in content, but in tone. The inner critic, prowling like a distant beast, thinned and then surged, trying to commandeer the microphone. He did not do anything graceful. He did not have a cinematic recovery with thunderous applause.
Instead, he performed the method name, interrupt, redirect, reinforce. He asked a clarifying question, bought a beat, and then offered a tight, honest answer. The room shifted. Backstage afterward, he did not celebrate with arrogance. He noted what worked, what felt shaky, and he recorded a single voice memo listing 2 elements to practice before the next event. The training had not produced perfect performance, but it had produced consistent competence. That distinction was everything. As he walked home that night, the city lights casting long reflections on the pavement, he felt a curious calm. The weapon inside him was not a cold machine. It hummed like a tuned instrument, precise, capable of making music, and requiring regular upkeep. He knew that the next chapters of his work would be harder. The inner critic lived in the stacked rituals of his past and would erupt in new forms. High-stakes moments would become more complex. There would be moral crossroads where influence could be used for lesser ends. He assigned himself an ethical valuation test so that every technique was aligned with service rather than manipulation. He had not finished training. He had, however, assembled a toolkit and a willingness to iterate. On a cold morning a few weeks later, as he prepared for what he knew would be perhaps the most testing public scenario yet, he paused in the stairwell. The building around him resembled a hive, people moving with intention, some unaware of the battles their minds were fighting. He tightened his scarf, felt the fabric against his chin, and rehearsed a line in his head that had become a mantra of sorts. Aim true, serve better. The door to the auditorium yawned open ahead, a thin line of light beyond it. He felt the old tremor of anticipation, and beneath it the deeper steadiness of practice. He stepped forward, the first syllable of his prepared opening forming in his mouth. Behind him, another thought rose, the inner critic, forming as it always does, warming up its rhetoric. He held the gap the training had given him, and with the ritual he had honed, began to speak. He felt the stage settle under his shoes like the first step onto an instrument. The opening words arrived not because he willed them into existence, but because he had given his mind a script small enough to hold under pressure. The crowd listened. A few faces tightened. Somewhere in the third row a phone screen blinked. He noticed the details he had rehearsed, the friction of fabric under his wrist, the dry patch on his tongue, the tiny click of the microphone when he adjusted it. All of that small architecture kept his attention away from imagined catastrophe and toward what he could actually influence. The Q&A came brisker than expected. A hand shot up with a question that carried the edge of accusation. An investor, lean and precise, asking about failures rather than wins.
The old reflex would have flushed him with explanations, with defensive footwork. Instead, he performed the trained pattern with the practical slowness of muscle memory. Label the emotion that surfaced, a quick circuit breaker under his breath, a one-line redirect that steered the exchange into the factual lane he preferred. He asked a clarifying question, then answered in 3 sentences that landed with the weight of evidence rather than the thinness of emotion. The room shifted a degree. Not transformation, but a small recalibration. Backstage, he did not celebrate with grandiosity. There was a quiet tally in his head. What had worked, what had felt brittle, where the inner critic had sniffed the seams. He recorded a voice memo, 2 items to sharpen the next week, and walked outside into the night air. The city breathed in and out, indifferent. That indifference was the last thing he needed to fight. The world would not conspire to protect his practice. Mastery would be patient work. The following days pulled him into another arc of the craft, installing success programming the way an engineer installs firmware. He had already been deleting habits and downloading mentors, but now the work turned technical and precise. He divided the process into 3 practical moves: deletion, downloading, debugging, and used a real failing pattern as a lab, his tendency to ruminate for hours after a business setback. Deletion began with a physical limit. He set a firm rule: no long-form rumination before sleep. When the habit wanted to run, he would force an immediate alternative, a 5-minute constructive debrief. The aim was not to deny emotion, but to break the endless loop that fed it. Brains need boundaries more than denials. Downloading required modeling someone who already held the habit he wanted. He chose a mentor not by fame, but by procedural clarity. A colleague who, after a failed launch, wrote 3 concrete lessons and 1 experimental action for the following week. He mimicked the colleague's debrief style for 7 days, adapting language until it fit his voice. The mimicry felt awkward at first. Imitation without editing feels false. He adjusted, made the actions smaller, and kept the emotional stakes manageable. Debugging was the iterative loop. Run the new program, observe the friction, and patch. He tracked what triggered relapses: late-night scrolling, caffeine after 6 p.m., conversations that replayed the error. He removed those friction points or added counterweights: a no-screen rule after 9, a short walk before bed, and a recorded statement he could play when the loop began. The small engineering changes mattered. Practice: deletion, downloading, debugging. Identify 1 unhelpful mental loop that costs energy. Set a 2-day deletion boundary that interrupts it, e.g. a time limit or physical change. For 7 days, adopt 1 small mentor habit that replaces the loop.
Each night, record 1 friction point and adjust the following day. At the same time, he expanded the toolbox with advanced techniques that would serve as turbochargers, not miracles, but accelerants when applied carefully. Mental time travel became central, not fantasy, but method. He practiced stepping into a vantage point 5 years hence and viewing today's choice through those eyes. The future self was not a prophet, but an anchor, with longer priorities and a cooler affect. The first time he did this in full, he sat in his parked car and imagined a desk in a sunlit office, his future self's hands folded over an open calendar. That future person noticed patterns in small decisions: how he spent mornings, whom he trusted with truth, the questions he asked before signing contracts. The future self didn't urge risk for thrills. It prized consistent, principled moves. That voice suggested a small deletion now. Do not start a new project this month. Finish one you have already begun. It was a small, disciplined constraint. He followed it and later thanked that version of himself. Multidimensional thinking supplemented time travel. Instead of simple pros and cons, he ran 3 lenses across a decision: future time, relational impact, and identity alignment. A single choice that looked attractive short-term sometimes failed the identity test. Did the action match the story he wanted to live? He began to prefer trades that stacked positively in at least 2 of the 3 domains. Attention hacking, which at first had been about reducing notifications and adjusting chair position, became tactical. He learned that attention could be recruited by precise prompts: a question at the top of his notebook that framed today's main problem, a desktop background that reminded him of core measures, a small physical artifact on his desk that cued a practiced posture and a breathing pattern. He set environmental defaults that made desired behavior the easiest option. Small architecture produced less friction, and less friction allowed practiced habits to run with lower cognitive cost. Practice: mental time travel and multidimensional thinking. Before a decision, imagine the same choice 5 years from now. Ask, how will this affect my time, relationships, and identity? Write a 1-line summary of the likely long-term outcome. If the summary contradicts your identity anchor, pause and redesign the move. With advanced techniques in rotation, he moved deeper into visualization and mental rehearsal, the real middleweight of the system. Visualization, he had discovered, demands sensory detail and error inoculation. It must include the expected success and the likely obstacles.
On a quiet afternoon, he built a rehearsal that lasted 20 minutes on paper and felt longer in the body. He pictured the room, the sound of the HVAC, the murmur at the back, the sudden off note of a technical glitch.
He felt the imagined cold air prick his skin and practiced the micro-movements, a quick pause, an inquiry, a recovery phrase. The imagination became a theater where failure could be practiced safely. He extended the rehearsal to what he called progressive realism. The first pass was clean, a flawless delivery. The second pass introduced small problems, an unresponsive projector, an audience member asking an aggressive question. The third pass raised stakes further. Each time he rehearsed recovery scripts until the muscle of the response felt plausible. When the real unexpected happened, it landed like a familiar prop, awkward but manageable. Guided visualization, sensory-rich rehearsal. Close your eyes and place yourself in a room where a small but meaningful conversation will occur. Notice the light on the table, the temperature, the sound of chairs. Now imagine a challenge, a skeptical comment, a cut that lands wrong. Feel the spike in your chest and name it. Practice the exact first words you'll use to buy time, a clarifying question, and then a sentence to steer the exchange to facts. Replay the scene with a small recovery if your voice falters. Open your eyes and jot down the first 2 recovery phrases you used. He used visualization not to escape reality, but to dent its surprise. The imagination allowed him to inoculate the nervous system against novelty, so that when novelty arrived in life, it was only new at the edges. Parallel to rehearsal, he deepened his practice of influence, not as manipulation, but as service. Influence, he realized, often begins with state management. Leaders shape the emotional climate around them. He practiced modulating tone, pacing, and question selection to invite rather than coerce. At a weekly team meeting, he experimented. Instead of dictating fixes, he led with a pattern of curiosity that nudged others to propose solutions. The result was not theatrical, it was more sustainable. People were more engaged and felt ownership. He also practiced question mastery, short, strategic questions that reveal rather than assume. What's the simplest first step that would improve this by transformative? Influence anchored in clarity and invitation works better and lasts longer than influence that relies on pressure. Practice influence through state and questioning. Before your next meeting, choose one brief question that invites ownership. Pair it with a 2-second pause and a steady breathing pattern. After the meeting, note one moment where the question changed the dynamic. As programs became more practiced, he turned attention to creating automatic success patterns, responses that did not require constant conscious monitoring. He designed triggers and tiny routines that catalyze prepared behavior. A red pen on the left corner of his notebook became the cue to rehearse 3 questions before any conversation.
A particular playlist cued focus and marked the start of deep work. These cues were intentionally small and consistent. Brains learn patterns not because they are grand, but because they are repetitive. He also used environmental design to make regressed behaviors harder. The kitchen drawer that held his phone was replaced with a basket across the room. Notifications were limited in hours. Social cues were rearranged. He told 2 close colleagues about his practice so they could provide gentle checks. The social environment, once aligned, reduced the bandwidth needed to maintain new habits. Practice automatic success patterns. Identify one frequent decision you want automated. Choose one physical cue to pair with the desired action for 14 days. Keep the action tiny, 1 sentence, 1 question, 1 breath. Track whether the action occurs when the cue appears, and iterate. Then chaos arrived, not as a hypothetical, but as a real test of anti-fragility. The market shifted suddenly. One of the partners announced an unexpected resignation, and the news hit the press with a headline shaped for drama. He watched the ticker turn red and felt a familiar adrenaline. This was not a presentation or a conversation. This was a wave that could reshape months of work. His training had not prepared him for everything. There were holes. He had practiced recovery from public questions and negotiated mindset for team meetings, but mass panic has its own grammar. He convened an emergency call with the cohort and felt his chest tighten as the voices on the line sped up, trading interpretations faster than facts could arrive. He paused. That pause was the work. He labeled the anxiety, not to dismiss it, but to reduce its immediate authority. System alarm. He employed a state stack he had practiced. Posture correction. A breath that counted to 4. A short recall of a non-work win that grounded his identity, and then a concrete next step. He asked each person on the call to state one verifiable fact and one proposed first step. The protocol slowed the conversation, anchored it in reality, and created a practical path forward. The team appreciated the clarity.
Momentum returned not because he was fearless, but because the gathered method channeled the group's attention. Chaos also revealed the value of redundancy. The automatic patterns he'd built, cue, rehearsal, micro-reward, didn't stop everything, but they buffered responses. When an irate client called, he had a script to move the interaction from grievance to resolution. When a colleague sent a cutting email, he had a short ritual to prevent spiraling. Name, tap, a 5-minute debrief followed by a redirection practice. The tools didn't remove the sting, they shortened it. Practice. Maintaining mastery during chaos. Identify one likely source of disruption in your work. Build a 3-step protocol. Label the immediate sensations. Perform a short physical reset, and ask for one verifiable fact plus one next step.
Practice this protocol in a low-stakes simulation this week. All of this preparation led, inevitably, to the final test. The inner critic materializing not as an internal whisper, but as a sustained, roaring voice at a time when leverage was highest. It happened on a late night when exhaustion and exposure met. He had been awake, writing responses to sensitive messages, and a cascade of private doubts flooded in. The inner critic, having been fed by years of narrative, pressed its case. You are out of depth. They will see through you. You are not enough. The voice was not rational. It used impressions, old evidence, and selective memory. It was clever in its messaging because it cared only for one thing: to protect the old identity by keeping him small. The training he had done now needed to be scaled and concentrated. He moved into a layered defense. First came voice labeling. He spoke the critic's claims into his phone and labeled them as projection, old family line, performance fear. Naming separated him from the speaker. Next, he used the thank and dismiss method he had practiced in solitude. He thanked the critic for trying to protect him, acknowledged the point it made in functional terms, and then dismissed it as not useful for the task at hand. The wording was not flippant, it was pragmatic. Thank you for trying to keep me safe. Right now I need useful input. That's not helpful. This was not self-betrayal, it was a reallocation of attention. But the critic kept prowling. He needed reinforcement. He pulled up a short file of evidence, a set of 3 voice memos from people who had praised his clarity, one email where his decision had saved time, and a note he had written 6 months prior about one steady gain. The evidence did not erase fear, but it reoriented his cognitive field toward factual signals rather than narrative drama. When fear tried to hijack action, he used action to reclaim agency. He composed a short factual message to a partner asking for a single piece of data. When the critic flared that he was being petty, he reminded himself that small facts yield useful friction. The combination of labeling, thank and dismiss, evidence review, and immediate micro-action broke the spiral. The next morning, he did not announce victory. Instead, he ran a practice he had learned to call layered rehearsal. Vocalize the critic's line, write a factual rebuttal, practice the redirect phrase 5 times, and then simulate a 3-step action plan in which the redirection is the first move. The choreography of thought, voice, and action made the response more automatic. Practice, facing the inner critic. When the critic grows loud, speak the claim aloud and label it. Thank the voice for its intent, then write one factual piece of evidence that contradicts it. Compose a 2-word redirect and practice saying it until it lands less like a slogan and more like a tool. Follow with one small action that aligns with the redirect.
That final test was not a single moment, but a series of moments that revealed the nature of his work. Mastery is not a finish line, but a system that yields better responses more often. The inner critic would come back in other shapes. He had learned to treat it as a weather pattern rather than a verdict. With the intense tests behind him, or more accurately, integrated into the training, he organized everything into a plan he could hand someone beginning from scratch. The path is not a ladder with guaranteed arrival. It is a map with practices to try, measure, and adjust. He wrote a practical progression that echoed his own process. Start small, build redundancy, train with sensory detail, expose the system to mild stress, then scale. Phase 1, Foundations, days 1 to 30. Commit to one focused practice. Pick a single habit loop, something to notice and interrupt. The first month is about awareness and interruption. Do the awareness prompt daily. Label one recurring thought and note its physical location. Choose one circuit breaker and practice it until it is accessible without thought. Phase 2, Installation, days 31 to 66. Layer redirection and reinforcement. Create one redirect phrase that is actionable and believable. Pair it with a micro-reward to anchor the new response. Begin weekly mentor downloads. Imitate one functional behavior for 7 days and adapt it. Phase 3, Inoculation, days 67 to 90.
Introduce controlled stressors, small exposures that recreate the likely interruptions in your life. Use rehearsal with progressive realism. Add time travel and multi-dimensional checks into your decision-making. Build at least 2 automatic cues in your environment to reduce cognitive cost. Phase 4, maintenance and scale. After day 90, create redundancy and recovery habits. Schedule weekly micro-debugging sessions, a 15-minute review of practices, 1 friction point, and 1 test to try next week. Keep a short evidence feed, 3 items per week that document small wins. Continue mentorship and add heavier inoculations as readiness grows. Each phase carries measurable actions and a clear focus. Progress is probabilistic and personal. What worked for him required iteration. He kept his plan flexible and insisted on evidence over rhetoric, data from his journal, voice memos, and partner feedback. Over time, the evidence built a case that the mind could be repointed. He also embedded ethical checks. The training increased influence. Power without alignment is dangerous. He set 3 ethical questions to ask before deploying any technique in service of influence. Does this align with honest service? Who benefits? Could this method harm someone if misused? If the answers failed, he did not use the technique. He held the weapon metaphor as a moral constraint. Precise tools require responsible hands. As the months became years, the man's life did not turn into a montage of dramatized victories.
There were continued setbacks, quiet, dull afternoons where momentum slipped, and moments of confusing plateau. The training did not guarantee a life without pain. It guaranteed, however, a method to respond to pain with cleaner tools. One evening, when he least expected it, the neighbor's child, now older, ran up the hallway with an unasked question about bravery. The child wanted to know whether the man ever felt afraid. He answered honestly, "Yes, fear arrives, but fear can be managed." He showed the child a small exercise. Take a slow breath, name the feeling, and then say one small action you will take next. The child repeated it, and then ran off, less burdened. In that small exchange, the purpose of his training became plain. The weapon lives in service. There is an odd grace to mastering a mind. It does not make one immune to sorrow or error. It makes one available. The mind, trained like a weapon, becomes a tool that is more reliably owned than it had been before. Instead of being carried by autopilot, the person carrying the mind chooses the direction. If this story carries an instruction, it is that practice matters more than inspiration. Rehearsal builds capacity. Evidence pacifies the critic. Small environmental nudges reduce failure. Ethical anchors prevent misuse. The work is iterative and repairable. The scientist in him always left room for new data. Before closing, a brief guided practice pulled from the book of routines he lived by. It is not a miracle. It is a rehearsal you can use tonight. Evening practice, the 5-minute reset. 1. Sit upright and notice 3 sensations: feet on the floor, breath at the nostrils, weight of hands on your lap. 2. Name one recurring thought that has shown up today. Say its label aloud. 3. Perform a circuit breaker, a firm heel drop or wrist tap 3 times. 4. State a short redirect sentence in present tense, no more than 6 words. 5. Record a 1-line outcome. What small action did you take after the redirect? Do this for 21 nights in a row. Note patterns, not moral judgments. Keep the record simple. Small, consistent evidence rewires how the brain evaluates change. When he finished writing the plan that night, he felt, predictably, a new slope of anxiety. The work of keeping systems alive feels like maintenance. He accepted the rhythm. The weapon would demand upkeep. He had also learned to design celebration into the practice. Not grand parties, but small factual acknowledgments that the brain could store as evidence. After a month of consistent redirects, he allowed himself a slow coffee with no rush, and acknowledged win that required no fanfare. The brain likes recognition. When it gets it in measured doses, the new circuits feel useful rather than coerced. In the quiet that followed the plan's completion, he returned to an earlier image, the weapons room inside his skull. It had been the place of decision, now cleaned, organized, and labeled. Tools hung in order.
Some were sharp and ready. Others needed polish. The point was not perfection, but readiness. The last memory he built into this telling was a small scene, a morning run on the river path, the city lit in thin slices through trees. He ran a familiar route, breathing with cadence, and found his mind drifting into the old loops. He labeled the drift, tapped his thigh, recalled a recent concrete win, and then chose a small experimental question to hold for the day. The experiment was tiny. Instead of answering the first email that triggered anxiety, he would respond with one clarifying question. The rest of the morning unfolded differently because one small choice redirected more than the email thread. It moved his mood, his posture, and the feel of the day. That is the last image, the man on the river path, not transformed into a myth, but a person who knows his mind's mechanisms and is willing to maintain them. He walks forward not with guarantees, but with a practical plan, with humility about the brain's complexity, and with a steady resolve. If this narrative has done its job, it is given a map and a modest invitation. The work is yours to try. There is no single technique that will fix everything. There is, however, a method, small practices stacked into a system that reliably recalibrates how decisions are made. Choose one practice from this story and commit to 30 days. Build the simplest habit you can manage. Label one thought per day, practice one circuit breaker, and write one line of evidence. Track it honestly. If it works, expand. If it fails, debug with curiosity. Mastery is the accumulation of such cycles. Now, step forward, aim true, serve better. If you found this story useful, consider following the series for more guided practices and a downloadable 30-day practice sheet to keep the momentum.